Good morning, everyone. My name is Alexis Wick at AUB in the Department of History and Archaeology. It has been a long night for many of our guests, including our guest of honor, whose luggage, in fact, did not make it with him. So we feel particularly grateful for your cooperation on such an early start, and I apologize for the delay. Honored guests, dear friends, colleagues, students, it is with great pleasure that we welcome you to the American University of Beirut for our international symposium in honor of Talal Asad, entitled The Idea of Islam Today Towards Non-Orientalist Genealogies. I think I speak for the entire university, if not the city as a whole, in saying that it is a genuine honor to have you all with us here today. Though this is a very personal event, as Dalia will elaborate on a little bit in a minute, it is also in so many ways an institutional event, indeed a regional one. The AUB is a unique space in the global academic landscape, sitting as it does at the interface of so many traditions, discursive or otherwise, and so many stories. It is the perfect setting to think the issues that interest and concern us all in this very moment. The organizers want to extend, first of all, our thanks to those who made this possible, to the sponsors, namely the Office of the Provost, the Arts and Humanities Initiative, led by our esteemed colleague, Professor Maher Jarrar, who has been tremendous in all this, the Center for Arab and Middle East Studies, the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, again to Professors Maher Jarrar and my esteemed colleague Nader Al-Bizri in particular, who have spared nothing in supporting this project from the start, to Dr. Walid Hasboun and Dean Patrick McGreevy, who helped sustain it, and above all, to Ms. Rita Basil, without whose efficiency and grace, none of this could have happened. Further thanks are due to the speakers, many of whom have come from quite far and gone through great trouble to take part in this conversation, and to the chairs of the panels, who will frame it and regulate it. They have been instructed to use an iron fist when it comes to time. Thanks also to all the rest of you who have come to join in this conversation. But first and last, I must thank Talal for bringing us all together and for agreeing to come along for the ride, as well as Tanya for allowing us to have him for a few days away from her. It is a great regret that she could not be here with us today. I would like to ask first Dr. Dalia Jbara, postdoctoral fellow at the AUB Arts and Humanities Initiative, to bring us closer to the subject at hand. She will talk a little about the genesis of the event, and will be followed by Professor Nader Al-Bizri to my right, who, amongst other things, is the coordinator of the new Islamic Studies program, to speak to us about the launching of the program at AUB, under whose aegis our activities are taking place. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Ali, and thank you to everyone for being here. As Ali said, it is indeed, has been indeed a very long night for many of us, and an early start as well, so I shall keep this very brief. This event has been long in the making. In fact, it contains within it multiple temporalities, if you will. In the long term, it is grounded in the many discussions that we have had, Ali and I and others, on generally the problem of interdisciplinarity, and more precisely, how one can read properly works outside of the disciplinary arena within which they operate. In other words, since Talal Asad repeatedly insists, and I think rightly, on grounding his interventions explicitly in conversation with his own discipline of anthropology, the question we had been pondering is how can or should non-anthropologists, in our case historians, engage and interpret him without failing his own premises. This is a deep and a complicated problem involving the very structure of our mode of thinking, which I expect we will discuss directly or indirectly in our various talks over the next 2 days. In the medium term, the theme of this symposium has to do with a question that has concerned many of us, and which has figured prominently, at least in my own work, and that is the tension between the concept of genealogy on the one hand and tradition on the other, both of which Talal has mobilized to such great effect, or on another plane and in another register perhaps, the tension between rupture and continuity. Having done research on Islamic intellectual history and the history of Al-Azhar in particular, that crosses the 18th and 19th centuries, even as it converses with the 20th and the 21st, the question of genealogy and tradition has been both a challenging and a fertile node of reflection for me, as it has for many others. Finally, in the more immediate context, the actual trigger for this event is, of course, the launching of an Islamic Studies program at AUB. The issue that has concerned us in this regard, on both a strategic and an epistemological plane, is how should the study of that category labeled Islam, quote unquote, be structured here in Beirut? That is, what is our cutting edge niche here? What is it that we can offer that demarcates us from other institutions, especially in North America and Europe? And more profoundly, how does one study such a thing as Islam from that liminal space, both within and without, that AUB inhabits? What does it mean to practice Islamic studies in the Muslim world, and a troubled Muslim world at that? And by what ways can one transcend the traditional specificities and strictures of the field, including Orientalism as authoritative discourse in Talal's phrase, in thinking academically and disciplinarily about the subject? Above all, however, this event is in effect a debt repaid, however short. We have wanted to honor Talal in this way, to reciprocate the gift of the boundless intellectual generosity and personal care that he has shown us and so many others around us as readers, students, scholars, and friends. When we first expressed these ideas to Provost Ahmed Dalal in a very skeletal form about a year ago, he instantly put wind in our sails, and to a great extent gave direction to this voyage. He has been involved in every stage of the project from the very start, helping us fine-tune it through his own expertise as a scholar of Islam, and to execute its organization despite his tremendously busy schedule. And with these words, I turn the stage over to Professor Nadir El-Bizri, and again, thank you, Talal, and thank you all for coming.
Esteemed colleagues, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to address your assembly, this Majlis al-Ilm, in honor of Professor Talal Asad, and also to share with you some highlights regarding the inauguration of our Master of Arts in Islamic Studies at the American University of Beirut. This program is based at the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies, which is itself a dynamic locus of graduate programs and forums that support various kinds of academic events and activities, and is supported by a global, regional, and local network of scholarship. The new MA in Islamic Studies is aimed at providing a liberal and critical framework to study the religious, cultural, and textual traditions of Islam, using contemporary academic scholarship and methods, while being also informed and possibly rooted in traditional forms of learning and knowledge in the Muslim intellectual milieu. The uniqueness of this program also emanates from the fact of being situated in a locale like that of the AUB, which also reflects some kind of connection with local and regional traditions, while approaching the study of Islam via academic methods of inquiry, critical, analytic, and historical modes of reflection, and guided by scholarship in the humanities, arts and letters, and the social sciences. The MA aims also at engaging the existing rich expertise of our AUB faculty members by building on available resources that intersect with various academic units in the university, covering history, sociology, anthropology, philosophy, Arabic and Middle Eastern studies, comparative literature, and political science. And we have expertise in all of these domains within various academic units, centers, and programs at the university. It also benefits from a series of initiatives at AUB that include the establishment of the Farouk Jabr Center for Arabic and Islamic Science, the Arts and Humanities Initiative, which is also the main sponsor of the event today, the Civilization Sequence Program, the Anis Maqdisi Program in Literature, which is also an outreach program that interacts with the cultural life of Beirut, and also the archives and special collections at the Jaffet Library, especially in terms of their new initiative to introduce a course on codicology in association with the Islamic Manuscripts Society, TIMA. Furthermore, the MA in Islamic Studies offers the opportunity to potentially undertake collaborative research across disciplines amongst the faculty members at AUB, and hopefully will consolidate the profile of the university in terms of its promotion of the humanities, liberal arts, and particularly Arabic and Islamic studies. We are aiming at accepting candidates from various fields of study to be admitted into the program, so please spread the word. We are hoping that we will give them the training in the languages, histories, cultures of Islamic civilizations, while also developing critical insights into the political, intellectual, literary, and social history of Islam up to the present day. The program is also aiming at expanding the knowledge and understanding of classical and modern Islamic intellectual history, religious thought, as well as developing the possibility of mastery in a field of specialization, and developing a knowledge and appreciation of the niceties of the Arabic language and of another Semitic language or of additional European language other than English. And the students will be exposed in directed and individualized study to methodological and conceptual issues that support the thematic needs of their research in terms of historiography, philology, codicology, as well as critical reasoning, political thought, social analysis, ethnographic investigation, and philosophical reflection, depending on the area in which they will specialize. The students will be receiving regional studies from within the region and about it, and they will have a first-hand experience of the dynamic cultural life in the city of Beirut, with its interreligious diversity and the potential of reinforcing existing links and continuing interactions and collaborations we have already with multiple centers of research and learning in Beirut and Lebanon, such as the Orient Institute, the Institut Français du Proche-Orient, the Near East School of Theology, معهد المعارف الحكمية للدراسات الدينية والفلسفية, the Sapiential Knowledge Institute, مركز دراسات الوحدة العربية, the Center for Arab Unity Studies, and other programs that we have developed collaborations with other universities, particularly Université Saint-Joseph and Notre Dame University. And I promised that I will just report on the MA to you and not engage in theoretical issues. So I thank you for bearing with me in receiving these highlights about our program. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor El-Bizri. Thank you, Dr. Jbara. Without further ado, please, I welcome our first speakers and our esteemed chair, Professor Maher Jarrar. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Professor Asad, thank you for joining us. Dalia and Ali, thanks a million for the organization, cooperation, intellectual input, and foremost thanks to Provost Talal for his continuous support for arts, humanities, Islamic studies at AUB, intellectual vigor, among other things, and foremost. I'll introduce the panelists, our three guests, at the beginning. Each has half an hour, 20 to 30 minutes, let's say, and then I open the floor for discussions and questions. I start from my right, extreme right. Professor Stefan Leder is Professor of Arabic and Islamic Studies at Martin Luther University in Halle, Germany, and Director of the Orient Institute in Beirut. Prior to his engagement with the OEB, he was chairman of interdisciplinary research institutions funded by the DFG, German Research Foundation, and by his home university at Halle. His research topics combine history, literature and textuality, applying text criticism, discourse analysis, and intertextual analysis. His published work covers Arabic historiography with particular attention given to narratology, Islamic tradition under the perspectives of authority of knowledge, transmission and moral politics, and the Bedouin patrimony in Arabic thought and discourse. He also writes on the history of Oriental studies in Europe, and his current research projects at the OEB concern medieval political literature and the intellectual and political role of the Ayyubid chancery exemplified by the critical edition of Al-Qadi Al-Fadil's correspondence. Provost Ahmad Dalal is the provost of the American University of Beirut and professor of history in its Department of History and Archaeology. He received his BE from AUB's Department of Mechanical Engineering and has PhD in Islamic Studies from the Department of Middle East Languages and Cultures at Columbia University. He joined AUB in summer of 2009 from Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., where he served as the chair of the Department of Arabic and Islamic Studies. His previous academic appointments were at Stanford University, 2000 to 2003, Yale University, 1994 to 2000, and Smith's College, 1990 to 1994. Dalal's scholarship focuses on the history of science, Islamic revivalist thought, and Islamic law. His most recent publication, Islam, Science, and the Challenge of History, was awarded in 2013 the Distinguished Prize of the Kuwait Foundation for the Advancement of Sciences. In this book, he traces the historical delineations between scientific knowledge and religious authority in Muslim societies. And it is based on the Dwight H. Cherry lectures that he delivered at Yale University in 2008. Professor Ibrahim Musa is professor of Islamic Studies in the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies and in Notre Dame's Department of History. He co-directs Contending Modernities, the Global Research and Education Initiative, examining the interaction among Catholic, Muslim, and other religious and secular forces in the world. He joined Notre Dame in the fall of 2014 from Duke University, having previously taught at the University of Cape Town, 1989 to 1998, and Stanford University, 1998 to 2001. His interests span both classical and modern Islamic thought, with a special focus on Islamic law, classical and modern history, ethics, and theology. He is the author of Ghazali and the Poetics of Imagination, winner of the American Academy of Religions' best first book in the history of religions in 2006, and editor of the last manuscript of the late Professor Fazlur Rahman, Revival and Reform in Islam, a study of Islamic fundamentalism in 2005. He was named the Carnegie Scholar to pursue research on Islamic seminaries of South Asia, and his next book, What is a Madrasa, is forthcoming from the University of North Carolina Press. Please welcome with me the three esteemed speakers, and we begin with Professor Stefan Leder. The floor is yours.
Thank you. We need both, huh? First of all, good morning, everybody. I want, of course, to express my thanks to the conveners of this very interesting opening symposium under that challenging and stimulating title, The Idea of Islam Today. I'm grateful for the invitation and that my contribution to this discussion aiming at thinking through the idea of Islam was accepted. The new study program is an exciting perspective for us as the OIB and may become a stimulation for our work and perhaps a productive frame also to rethink some terms and assumptions which carry our Orient studies. But I am before all very curious to hear all these daring contributions to that symposium, and all the more as I do not have a new epistemology to offer, and my attempt to reframe Islamic studies may prove rather insignificant for your more ambitious intentions. I'm aware, of course, of how meaningful it can be to explore the patterns of reformist thought emerging in response to the encounter with a hegemonial European culture. How this caused the expansion of the functional domain of religion and even informed the appropriation of history, as Ahmed Dalal has shown so convincingly. The perspectives of entangled history, the comparative approach exploring correspondence, common grounds, and reciprocity may be excellent tools to transcend outdated essentialist conceptions. I am not quite on this track today. When dealing with temporally more distant, pre-modern concepts of the polity, a meaningful way of connecting this matter to present horizons is to ask in how far the historical discourse corresponds with abstract and general categories established in current theory. Discourses on political rule, siyasa mulk, on its power basis, sulta, and regular means, ahkam, on governance, tadbir, legitimacy, sharia, and illicit practices, dhulm, moved beyond the theology of the imamate since the 11th and 12th centuries and focused on sultanic polities and their extended form in the early modern empire. They are inconceivable without reference to Islamic teachings, but they are also indissolubly linked to the common sense of political thought, evident in the idea that rules of good governance are universal, deriving from wisdom and experience of various cultural origins, and demonstrated through accurate diachronic predicaments and analysis which refer to specific circumstance. You have both elements here. Islamic tradition, in this sense of reference to authorities or authenticized texts, thus is an ingredient, sometimes contentious and challenging, but always blended with discourses on power and legitimacy. It thus may be a matter of personal taste whether we label this literature as Islamic or Middle Eastern, as Islamic is often used as a general qualifier to convey that this is not the European or Western tradition. However, this term, Islamic, carries a political signification which can be rather disturbing, as this is directly related to the denomination of Islamic studies. I think it might be helpful to share some of my experience in that field. As it was just said by Professor Jarar, prior to my engagement at the OIB, I taught Arabic and Islamic studies at the university in Halle, once one of the sites of German Orientalism, the heart and politics of which were studied by Suzanne Marchand in great detail through an approach to scholarly practice and with the claim that, I quote, modern Orientalism has furnished at least some of the tools necessary for constructing the post-imperialist worldviews of today. This particular Islamic program was established there in the mid-90s only, and at the beginning I noticed a lack of differentiation between Islamic apologetics and the neutral professional approach to Near Eastern history and Islam, which we wanted to refer to. Such misapprehension may occur in various contexts, but for my reading it was specifically informed by the Marxist doctrine of that time, of the time before 1989, in then East Germany. the dogmatic distance towards the superstructure of religion and the deep secularization of society made the religious connotation of the term look divergent and disturbing. From that perspective, it was inconceivable that the attribute Islamic could be used, like it is commonly done, as a rather neutral and vague denominator covering intellectual history, thus religious and other traditions, and even more generally, culture and society associated with Islam and Muslims. The secular dogma of the state had also nourished or dialectically fostered Christian faith as a deviating political orientation among a small, mostly educated minority. For both, Islamic studies meant a partisan undertaking, suspicious in the eyes of the one, ambivalently welcome in the eyes of the latter. If we put aside this particular context, the little incident may be indicative of the ambiguity which surrounds the term with respect to content, intent, and authority. This is a birth defect of Islamic studies. Conceived as a child of Orientalism, Islamic studies inherited its documentary textual outlooks, and with the emergence of the concept of universal history, highlighting the uniqueness of the Western European civilization, it inherited an inclination towards patronizing judgments. The idea of a new episteme, Islam, answered to the needs of introducing the category of the present time into a predominantly historical perspective of the Orient. When Karl Heinrich Becker, one of the founding fathers of Islamwissenschaft, Islamic studies, explained his new subject matter in the first issue of the international journal Der Islam in 1910, this journal is still thriving, under the title Islam as a Problem, he was both logically incoherent and institutionally successful. Incoherent because he himself refers to the fact that, quote, we use the term Islam in a wide variety of meanings, referring to religion, the Oriental empires, a countless number of polities, and even to the Mohammedan states of the present. And something much bigger is called Islamic, and that is a political theory, whether it is based on state law or eschatology, quote, end of quote. His ambition to establish a new discipline within the canon of the Faculty of Philosophy against the hegemonic presence of classical studies and in contrast to the philological constraints rooted in classical and biblical studies prevailed. It was initially propelled by the epistemological shift of claiming practical value for German colonial aspirations in correspondence, let's say, with the mariage de convenience between the colonial state and anthropology. The contradiction between the particular vaguely Islamic or not at all Islamic and the general, essentially Islamic, is intrinsic to the concept of Islamic studies. In summary, Marshall Hodgson's suggestion of the wider term Islamicate would not resolve the problem because the inborn overlaps of Islamicate and Islamic make the term vague and the argument circular. The semantics of the current term Islamic extends to its negation. And if it is not used banally as an instrument of claims and assignments, or as a mere demarcation of assumed difference, our reference to it needs to be defined by content and intent. In how far would we describe the thinker and poet Abu A'la al-Ma'arri, for instance, as an Islamic author, and in how far would we prefer another reference frame, philosophy or poetry? The teachings of the dissident Sheikh Abdallah al-Alayili, died 1966, for instance, are considered Islamic, of course, even if the latitude which the author concedes to circumstantially define human agency for the delineation of religion is quite extraordinary. I quote, "Inna din thawratun mustamirra ومتجددة ومتفاعلة مع الإنسان في عصره ومكانه. Whereas our own biographies and involvement in matters of Islam may influence how we address and what we address, any categorical distinction between a vision of Islam from within and from without is heuristically meaningless. It would contradict a de-essentialized approach to Islam as generally a voluntary framework of reference, not an objective category. Also, experience contradicts this distinction between inside-outside. Here I refer to the very young experience of establishing programs on Islamic theology at several of our universities, designed to provide Islamic teaching by Muslims for future imams, school teachers, and community workers. In fact, the overlap with Islamic studies taught in the realms of the liberal arts at our faculties of humanities seem to belie the ideological debates which accompanied this initiative. Much of what we do and have to do in face of the huge quantity of unexplored and understudied material consists in contextualizing ideas, events, and biographies, and relating discourses to issues that we explain and justify. Exactly this is the link between the Islamic studies and confessional defined program, and it is the OIB's link also to the Azhar University today. The ideas of Islam today thus may become apparent by the way we address Islam of the past through establishing correlations. Political theory, as mentioned in the quotation above, is a classical topic of assumptions about Islamic civilization, manifest in the concept of Oriental despotism or patrimonial sultanic rule, as in Max Weber's more sophisticated ideal type of traditional rulership. Inspired by the conceptualization of modernity, this term, of course, contrasts older notions of the powerful potentate represented, for instance, in the Elizabethan drama by, for example, Christopher Marlowe's Tamburlaine. And it contrasts contemporary modern scholarship also when this is not captured by an interest in the conception of the nation state. Let me just remember Julius Wellhausen, the historian and biblical scholar back in the 19th to early 20th century, who pursued the idea of an old Arab society without magistracy because it would allow him, by way of analogy, to construct how monotheism, that is here Jewish monotheism, came into being as a structure of authority. The idea of despotism as a characteristic of the Orient and Islamic civilization still is very much alive, of course. It also resonates in the contemporary critique of autocracy, istibdad, seen to be sustained by a tradition which justifies absolute power through a theory of godlike rule and the like. In these discussions, modern ideas of sovereignty and participation are perceived in opposition to the political concepts of the past. They are either dismissed in favor of an Islamic model or perceived in fundamentally critical contrast to the past. When Abdillah al-Balqazi asserts in his State, Power and Law that the essence of the modern state needs to be acknowledged independent and disconnected, that is disconnected from the political realities of the past, that is ad-dawla al-taqlidiyya, ad-dawla al-sultaniyya, one has to agree, of course, and yet to ask what results from it. Must such an assumption dismiss the shades and inert intellectual options of concepts that arise from the heterogeneous discourses which constitute the conceptual political legacy? And in how far would it create an insurmountable line of demarcation between Islamic thought of the past and the challenge of the modern? I will try to explain this point in the following shortly. I think I still have a few minutes. The Islamic foundation of the polity is perceived as being laid out by discourses on rule, its legitimacy, aims, and means. the often treated issue of imama, which correlates the political and religious spheres in different constellations, as well as discourses on good rule following the sultanic paradigm characterized by the duality of political rule and religious authority, and treatises on wisdom and statecraft are the most important types of a heterogeneous and yet consistent and interrelated textual corpus produced over centuries by mostly Muslim authors from Spain to India and from Central Asia to the Sahara. This medieval Middle Eastern political literature is not entirely built on Islamic teaching, but remains, with a few exceptions, tightly connected with authorial Islamic voices. If we vote for addressing this as Islamic thought thus accommodates a multi-angled, often interrelated discussion of key issues of the polity in various contexts. In this literature, we spot and retrieve a critical stance against that retention of power becomes the ultimate goal of established rule. This is put in contrast with the reasonable imperative to balance general or public interest, al-masalih al-umum, and with the distant Islamic ideal, I refer here to Ibn Zafar, Ibn Khaldun, al-Sakhawi, and others. We also pursue in this universe of discourse the discussion of justice as a persuasive principle of successful rule and as a demand of reason, as an absolute moral imperative independent of religious practices and adherences. Justice appears as a demand made explicit by requests which relate to concrete historical circumstance. And we meet justice as a term denoting God's obligatory right, not law, haqq Allah. The arenas where authority is displayed appears as a shared space. The strained relationship between men of power and religious authority is discussed both in terms of rulership requiring control over the political ambitions of men of religion and from the perspective of religious ulama claiming the right and capacity to chastise and eventually correct injustice. As mentioned before, each articulation of these ideas deserves particular inquiry into context and circumstance. But since political literature legitimizes its challenging advisory stance very often by referring to rules, models, and counsels withdrawn from the diachronic dimension of history, and since discourses are very much interrelated through quotation, common sources, and unmarked intertext, it sustains a synchronic view of some of its aspects. It should give this view a demystified idea of the amalgamated manifestations of Islamic doctrine in this realm, which, on the other hand, and contrary to its reputation, indeed is dealing with issues central to political thought generally. Since the polity is not only structured by rule, but based upon Muslims who may derive from their Islamic doctrine criteria of whom to follow and obey and whom not, discourse on the polity is also dedicated to exactly these questions. Unlike dominant authorship practices in the realm of political literature, more specific textual practices are constituent of authority in this second realm. This point requires a more elaborate explication than can be done in the short time left. From the Ibadi community, non-militant Kharijites, as you know, of Oman, epistles are preserved similar to fatwa and are published from time to time, and we have also a publication coming soon. Addressed to the brethren in Eastern Iran, it explains the criteria of association, wilaya, and dissociation, bara'a, regarding both leadership, imama, and membership in the community. The extreme secessionism of the Kharijit makes the issue extremely complex and delicate. It requires reference to the earliest history of the movement and their association with companions of the Prophet. And it engages the author in a casuistic discussion of how to react to witness against an imam's righteous comportment. The fatwa is followed by an article of faith, Nasab al-Islam, a genre similar to an aqidah, where aspects of these questions, again, are treated. Very particular with respect to an archaic and quite elliptic style, its main source is the Quran. A first exploration, however, betrays that this seerah, sent at the beginning of the 10th century, was modeled and in part copied from an older epistle dated to the 8th century Common Era, preserving the stylistic peculiarities which may have been done explicitly to enhance authority. In any case, the reiteration of the authoritative statement gives evidence of the attention given to the authentication of the doctrine through copying the model. The idea that support of the political authority must be deliberate is also disseminated in Sunni tradition, even if controversially received. In a companion, here, let me just, yes. A companion of statements and recommendations encouraging the pious to exercise strict abstinence from any contact with the man of power and to decline from any responsibility in the juridical system or any other official function. The meticulous reference to the authorities which legitimize this position and mostly received in oral teaching is characteristic of how authority is construed. As shown elsewhere, this manuscript from the 9th century was originally a rather marginal script emerging from the early Hanbali teaching endorsing the autonomy of ulama against Abbasid attempts to expand political authority to religious matters. This tradition later was adopted and disseminated by well-known experts of Islamic tradition through a formal procedure of transmission, content, and the practices of treating the text, the practices of transmission, and of composing before, are thus closely related to the ground of value and an understanding of authority. This tradition, of course, was refuted later, and it is Muhammad ibn Ali al-Shawkani who has elaborated the most sound refutation of this position, justifying the task of the ulama to correct and interfere into unjust practices of state authorities. In conclusion, Islamic studies are not only, this is my suggestion here, constituted by the many redefinitions of Islam in theory and practice, but should be considered, if we hold on to this term, as a brand on its own, a brand of civilization studies, a field which needs to take care of the unique scholarly practices of the past.
Thank you very much, Professor Lido. I'll postpone the questions and answers till the end when we all finish. Provost Dalal.
Good morning. I will later today. I'll do some formal welcoming notes, but just very briefly, I just want to tell you how honored we are that you're all with us today. We really hope this will sort of set us on the right track as we launch our Islamic Studies program. And I want to thank Talal especially, and of course all of our guests for being with us today, and Dalia and Ali for all the work they've done. Dalia was too generous to include me. I mean, they're the ones who did all the work, conceptualized this conference, struggled with the notions, with the conceptualization of the conference, and worked very hard on making it a reality. So thanks to all. As the concept note for this conference states, something called Islam appears everywhere these days. Most recently, there is a rather understandable fixation on the threat posed by the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS or ISIL, or as you know, as they were known until recently, Daesh. Of course, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi banned the use of the term Daesh, so please don't tell on me, because I will be using the term Daesh. So there is a rather understandable fixation on Daesh and on the ways to contain or crush this group. But of course, the term Islam has been deployed in many other spheres. Its promoters in modern times often understand it as a religious doctrine, a legal system, and a complete way of life, subsuming within it not just a normative ethical code, but also an economic and political order, all the way, of course, to the very identity of a nation. To go back to Daesh, I submit at the outset that my knowledge is largely triggered by the fear this group instills and not by any serious systematic study. To be sure, there is much analysis of the confluence of factors that contributed to the rise of Daesh and other similar groups, the Daesh phenomena, starting from the effects of the American occupation of Iraq, the vacuum resulting from the disintegration of state structures in the region, which this and other groups rushed to fill, the move of some of the most brutal elements of old regimes, secular regimes quite often, as in the case of Iraq and the Daesh leadership specifically, especially in Iraq, to the ranks of the newly fashioned and well-funded sectarian groups, the opportunities provided to this and similar groups to expand territorially, attract seasoned fighters from all over the world in what some have dubbed jihad tourism, and to diversify their sources of funding, thereby gaining a margin of independence from their initial funders and masters. Of course, everyone knows the connections between Bandar bin Sultan and Qatar and the Kuwait jihad philanthropists, quote unquote, and their role in funding many of these groups. Much has also been written about this group's deliberate deployment of extreme forms of graphic violence, starting with ceremonial destructions of shrines and churches and mosques, to public stoning and crucifixion, to rape and enslavement of women and children of all religions, and on to beheadings that are defiantly displayed for the whole world to see. Violence, one should note, that was sufficiently intense to attract the attention of their foes. There is a campaign which is triggered by this violence now, but also violence that is intense enough to command respect, one should note, from many who seem to appreciate this type of defiance. Important as all of these contextual factors are, I think it's not sufficient to simply reduce this phenomena to its context. Now that this group can no longer be easily manipulated by its masters, and now that it has developed its myth and conviction that its jihad has changed the face of the world. One thing that is notably lacking in the understanding of this phenomena is where it fits in the Islamic ideological spectrum. In fact, it seems that the little insight into the ideology of this group is often gleaned from its quarrels with equally violent rivals such as Nusra or the recently obliterated Ahrar al-Sham, than from analysis by experts or academics. One telling example is the response. So there is interest in their violence, there is interest in their action on the ground, there is little less interest in studying them. And I would argue this is symptomatic of quite a bit of studies of modern Islamic movements. One telling example is the response issued by one of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's al-Khalifa lieutenants. I think his name is Abu Muhammad al-Adnani al-Shami. He's the one who's speaking recently. Samurai, yes, and Samurai. Yeah, he has many. The response issued by this guy to Ayman al-Zawahiri's call for ISIS to merge under the banner of al-Nusra in the fight in Syria. In this response, Zawahiri is told, sort of rebuked, that Al-Qaeda is an organization, Tanzim, and as such, the Islamic State can never be a branch of it. A Tanzim cannot, a state, a dawla cannot be a branch of a Tanzim, he's told. And that if anything, the organization and its leader should give allegiance to the head of the state. But more importantly, Zawahiri is criticized for giving orders to stop targeting common Shia, Awam al-Rawafid, under the pretext that they are Muslims who would be excused because of their ignorance. Zawahiri is also urged to correct his approach, minhaj, by pronouncing the unbelief of what ISIS refers to as the associating and impure Shia, al-Mushrikeen, al-Rawafid, al-Anjas, and so on, as well as the armies of, he should profess the kufr of the armies of Egypt, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Tunis, Libya, you name it, and many more, Yemen and others. And to stop beating around the bush and using complex analysis instead of calling them what God has called them, unbelievers and apostates. The point I'm trying to make here is not just that to Daesh, the head of the Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, is not radical enough, and in fact is so close to becoming himself a kafir for his failure to identify kufr, but that the kernel of the ideology of Daesh is a takfir embedded in the comfort of an absolute truth, the absolute certainty of doctrinal purity that only a very limited mind can sustain, an ideology that cannot be inconvenienced by political sophistication or concern for social justice. Now, this is all I'm going to say about Daesh. Maybe I'll come back a little bit at the end to Daesh. In my presentation today, I would like to focus on kufr. Not so much in the thought of Daesh, whom, as I said, I really haven't studied them in any systematic way, but kufr in early modern discussions of the subject. The elaboration of ideas on kufr and takfir amongst contemporary groups are often traced back to the thought of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. This genealogy is not completely accurate. And just to give a modern example, here around us, I mean, some of you might be familiar with the group called Al-Ahbash, and who consider the Wahhabis unbelievers. Although if you look at their literature, it's very similar. I mean, they use the exact same categories in pronouncing people and deciding whether people are believers or unbelievers. So there is a lot of internal split and splintering. And to trace everything back to Ibn Abdul Wahhab is not completely accurate. However, I think that the political context in which Wahhabism unfolded justifies singling it out as a convenient modern reference for a particular brand of takfiri ideology. So I'm going to use the Wahhabi thought, the thought of Ibn Abdul Wahhab specifically, himself, as a sort of convenient indicator of reference for this takfiri thought. And after a brief outline of this type of takfir, I will use the thought of Abdul Ghani al-Nabulsi to outline Islamic views articulated in the early 18th century. Nabulsi died around in the 30s of around 1730 or 31. So before he died, way before, I mean, after Ibn Abdul Wahhab was born, but way before Ibn Abdul Wahhab died. Ibn Abdul Wahhab died in 1792. But still, it's it's interesting. One could use in these two examples, and there are many more examples. Sort of a two traditions with regard to the issue of takfir. And the thought of Ibn Abdul Ghani al-Nabulsi reveals a widespread rejection of takfiri thought just before and certainly during and after the time of Ibn Abdul Wahhab. The purpose is to outline the main elements of a homegrown, if you will, homegrown, authentic, or whatever, Islamic response to takfir, which was not generated to please a modern liberal mindset. On first impression, Ibn Abdul Wahhab's writings seem to be devoted to a discussion of the concept of tawheed, which means professing the oneness of God. On closer examination, however, Ibn Abdul Wahhab's real focus was on classifying people on the basis of their creed into believers and unbelievers. And his subsequent actions, and the actions of many of his followers, were all predicated on this classification. Political and social concerns were marginal to his agenda. He made a distinction between politics and creed, and although he recognized that in promoting his cause he was indebted to the support of the local rulers, he neither couched his teachings in political language, nor did he consider the seizure of power an aim of his movement. The only tolerance he exhibits is in his attitude to unjust rulers, whom he says should be advised gently, and in the event they fail to heed this advice, they should still be obeyed, and their injustice should be tolerated patiently. Ibn Abdul Wahhab even distinguishes between what may be termed an injustice because of social and economic inequities, in his words, ظلم الأموال, and creedal injustice, which is called ظلم الشرك, the injustice of association of others with God. Needless to say, Wahhabi thought is focused on the second kind, whereas the first is tolerable as long as it's accompanied by tawheed. In Ibn Abdul Wahhab's view, the community may very well be represented by one person, one man actually. And the Quranic injunction to abide by the community, to abide by al-Jama'ah, may refer to an earlier generation of Muslims rather than to their contemporary consensus. As such, unity is of no importance, and neither are the venues that guarantee the empowerment and participation of the community in deciding its future. Withholding knowledge from the masses is permissible, and similarly, ijtihad is not an issue which he seriously addresses. In fact, in a couple of instances, he denies that he himself was a mujtahid. He also rejects the notion that a mujtahid is needed to bypass the authoritative works of the latter jurists in order to go back directly to the tradition of the first generation of Muslims. The Quran, he argues, has ambiguous and unambiguous verses. The latter are straightforward and require neither the explanation of earlier jurists nor the interpretations of contemporary mujtahids. He thus reduces the operativeness of the Quran to its unambiguous verses, and he dismisses the need for the intermediary tradition, but without replacing them with the empowering tool of ijtihad. The closest Ibn Abdul Wahhab comes to rejecting taqlid is when he blames it, together with the excessive veneration of scholars and saints, for much of the unbelief of his contemporaries. As such, his opposition to taqlid is used only to undermine traditional authority and is not contrasted with its logical opposite, ijtihad. Ibn Abdul Wahhab also does not hide his scorn for scholarship that disagrees with his position, and adds that enemies of God may have a lot of knowledge and many books to claim. Ibn Abdul Wahhab's ideology was generally intolerant of many practices and beliefs of individual Muslims. In his extensive discussion, I'm using again Ibn Abdul Wahhab, and I think many of these simple, straightforward ideas have become commonplace, and they're used and deployed over and over again in the contemporary discourse of some of these radical groups, including Daesh. In his extensive discussion of what constitutes unbelief, kufr, and the belief in more than one God, shirk, he lists numerous convictions and acts. Shirk includes supplicating pious people, living or dead, seeking their intercession, making vows to them, offering sacrifices and praying at their tombs, and attributing to the dead among them the power to harm or benefit. Shirk also includes the use of amulets and talismans, the provision of giving shelter to innovators, and the act of befriending unbelievers. It's very tough, that's shirk. If you have be careful if you have an unbelieving friend. The treatment of rabbis and monks as lords by offering them unquestioning obedience, and the worship of God through intermediaries. A person who knows both the Ash'ari school and the school of the first generation Salaf, and gives preference to the former over the latter, is also considered an unbeliever by Ibn Abdul Wahhab. In addition, someone who says, for example, "Take note, my brother, may you never know evil, la alimta sharran," or something along those lines, will also qualify as a kafir, since without knowledge of evil, one cannot know tawheed. And the list goes on and on. Kitab al-Tawheed, I urge you to take a look at it. It's a long table of content listing everything that one can think and do and say, which constitutes unbelief. It's through this emphasis on shirk and kufr that Ibn Abdul Wahhab introduces his theory of Tawheed. Tawheed, he argues, is the exclusive dedication of worship to God. It is worshiping God without shirk. The mere profession of faith is not sufficient for Islam because there is a difference between knowing the truth about God, ilm, actively affirming this truth, tasdeeq, and believing in it, iman. The first two kinds of recognition are possible for unbelievers, whereas iman involves full reliance on and fear of God. It also involves loving, hating, and making friends or enemies in the way of God. Ibn Abdul Wahhab's cautious attempt to develop a positive definition of Tawheed in terms of iman suffers a great setback when he argues that even someone with great love of God may be an unbeliever. There are, according to Ibn Abdul Wahhab, two kinds of Tawheed. The first is the Tawheed al-Rububi. Rab means Lord, so it is professing the lordly unity, if you will, and which is the belief that God is the creator and administrator of the universe. This belief is held by most people and was even held by the Arabs before the advent of Islam. The unbelievers in the pre-Islamic Jahiliyyah knew God, glorified him, believed that he was the only creator. That's, of course, Ibn Abdul Wahhab, not me. Believed that he was the only creator and that he alone could grant sustenance and bring life and death. They were followers of Ibrahim and performed the pilgrimage to Mecca, but they were still guilty of shirk because they associated partners with God in worship and supplicated and sought the intercession of prophets, angels, or pious people. In fact, according to Ibn Abdul Wahhab, they were not driven to oppose the message of Muhammad until he initiated hostilities against them and cursed their religion and scholars. The second kind of Tawheed demanded of humanity and required for true Islam is the Tawheed Uluhi, which is professing the godly unity, if you will. It entails bearing witness that there is one God and that Muhammad is his messenger, ridding oneself of shirk, abandoning the worship of anything but God, devoting all worship exclusively to God, and disowning the non-believers and taking them for enemies. Recognizing shirk is a prerequisite for this second kind of belief, and so is bara'a, dissociating oneself from unbelievers and disbelief in words and deeds. The concept of Tawheed is thus linked in the thought of Ibn Abdul Wahhab to an act of repudiation, which functions as a rite of intellectual initiation into this type of Islam, into Wahhabism. The non-initiated remains guilty of shirk. Armed with this concept of Tawheed, Ibn Abdul Wahhab argued that the first battle in Islam after the death of Muhammad was fought by Abu Bakr against people who claimed to be Muslims, but refused to pay taxes. This act of disobedience was reason enough for fighting them. The shirk of the time of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, on the other hand, is graver than the shirk of the first Jahiliyyah. The people who are supplicated are neither pious people nor objects that are obedient to God. So it's better to worship a stone than worship some of these people, Ibn Abdul Wahhab argues. And the shirk of the latter generations persists in times of plenitude and hardship alike. In this framework, the Wahhabi war against the hidden unbelievers of Islam is not only justifiable, but it is itself a condition for proper belief. Ibn Abdul Wahhab provides a grim and narrow theory of unbelief, which fails to link the creedal to the political or the social. Many, if not all, the issues discussed by Ibn Abdul Wahhab were also taken up by other 18th century thinkers in more complex and nuanced discussions. A diverse range of views were articulated in the course of either responding to Ibn Abdul Wahhab directly or, as in the case of Abdul Ghani al-Nabulsi that I will discuss in a minute, and in the course of discussing issues similar to those that Ibn Abdul Wahhab addressed. Invariably, however, these views contradicted Wahhabi ideas both in their details and overall spirit. So in the remaining part of my presentation, I would like to focus a little bit on the views of Nabulsi as a prototype of the opposite kind of thinking about kufr. And there is a range, by the way. There is a range of positions on this other side. Nabulsi who died in 1731, was one of the leading Sufis of his time, he addressed the question of unbelief and belief and the meanings of hidden and manifest association, shirk khafi and shirk jali, and he defended Sufi practices and knowledge that Ibn Abdul Wahhab considered embodiments of kufr. In addition to Sufism, Nabulsi was well versed in the traditional Islamic sciences. He wrote on most of the traditional disciplines, including hadith, tafsir, law, theology, medicine, and agronomy, agriculture. He has also, in case you're interested, a very big tome on dream interpretations, which is quite a reference work. It's really an interesting work. One of his most useful and widely circulated works is a comprehensive index of the 7 canonical books of hadith, including what he considers canonical is Malik's Muwatta and Ibn Majah's Sunan. Most of Nabulsi's works, however, are on Sufism, and many of these were devoted to the defense of Ibn al-Arabi, who's the archetypal unbeliever to Ibn Abdul Wahhab, to defense of Ibn al-Arabi and Ibn Arabi's doctrine of the unity of being, Wahdat al-Shuhud, and various other doctrines and practices that, again, in Wahhabi thought and Takfiri thought, are epitomes of unbelief. Nabulsi's views on kufr are relevant here because they reveal the widespread rejection of Wahhabi-like doctrines, long before Ibn Abdul Wahhab, and the circulation of ideas that bear great resemblance to those articulated by many earlier and later 18th century thinkers on the issue of takfir. The preponderance of ideas antithetical to Takfiri doctrines among the leading scholars of the period, before, during, and after the time of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, is a telling indicator of the general character of Islamic thought in this period, I would argue, but this is a different subject. Nabulsi's prescribed rules of engagement do not apply only to those who are reading his works, but extend equally to all Muslims, living or dead. While a Muslim should always be cautious when assessing his own actions, he or she should be generous in thinking about other Muslims. In fact, a positive judgment of other Muslims derives from a person's trust in God, both by entrusting God with the final judgment rather than taking matters into one's own hands, and by believing that, and I quote here, in the same way that God has bestowed beneficence on good doers during their life, he would extend the same benefits to them upon death, end of quote. In contrast to the Wahhabi stance, therefore, Nabulsi advises Muslims to be self-exacting but generous towards others. Damnation to hell, Nabulsi asserts, is guaranteed for people who unequivocally deny the existence of God or one of the prophets. Dwellers of hell also include tyrants and their accomplices, as well as hypocrites who display Islam and belief while in their hearts there exists either unbelief in God, association, or some kind of denial of the necessary beliefs of the Sharia or contempt of one of its branches. The principal sign of a hypocrite, I'm quoting Nabulsi here, the principal sign of a hypocrite is that God removes mercy from his heart. While Nabulsi does not rule out the possibility of identifying those who will suffer punishment on account of their sins or unbelief, he includes in this category people who either make an unequivocal profession of unbelief or who are oppressors and hypocrites and have no mercy in their hearts. It would seem, therefore, that Nabulsi was more willing to condemn Muslims on account of their intolerance than he would on account of suspected doctrinal or practical flaws. Nabulsi's argument clearly minimizes the ability to condemn people or on creedal grounds and shifts the emphasis to social concerns. Elsewhere, Nabulsi refines this argument by adding a legal component to it. He asserts that issuing, and I think this is extremely important, that issuing legal rulings, ifta, is not permissible in a generalized manner, without any kind of particularization, takhsis yani, and that a mufti must be a mujtahid who knows the proofs and legal indicants of the matter under examination. Nabulsi proposes this general rule in the introduction to an elaborate examination of whether singing and music or listening to both are permissible or forbidden. He argues that the scriptural basis for the prohibition of singing and music is operative in the particular cases when they are accompanied with forbidden heedless pleasures, lahu and malahi and so on. Nabulsi adds that when virtuous people listen to enchanting instruments, this particularization does not apply to them, nor do the views of the comprehensive jurist, الكامل, المفتي الكامل, refer to them, أو العالم الكامل. The basic judgment is that people are virtuous and religious unless sinfulness and depravity are known to prevail with certainty and without any doubt. Nabulsi explains further that what is meant by lahu is that which is prohibited, and by forbidden entertainment, that which distracts from the performance of obligations and duties. Otherwise, entertainment generally understood is not forbidden. Moreover, since eavesdropping and spying are forbidden in Islam, Nabulsi adds that in the absence of obvious evidence to the contrary, one ought to assume that people are decent and that their entertainment behind closed doors is not accompanied by forbidden acts. According to Nabulsi, therefore, a generalized prohibition of singing and music is based on imitation by ignorant people who, despite their incompetence, allow themselves to violate the religion and honor of Muslims who disagree with them. Nabulsi maintains that there are two kinds of jurists. First, the comprehensive, kamil jurists who know the principles as well as the branches of the law, and who know the particular situations and categories which determine the legal status of various beliefs and acts. Jurists of the second kind are incompetent. They reproduce questions from books of applied law, despite the differences between the four schools of law, and without understanding what these laws really meant to the scholars who spelled them out. They only reproduce them by imitating each other in their deficient understandings. Competent and thorough jurists, therefore, are careful because they are aware of the complexity of legal questions and the factors that need to be considered before issuing a ruling. Ignorant people, however, are reckless. They apply the rulings of earlier jurists without knowing what constitutes valid evidence in these rulings or how to apply these general rules to new situations. Nabulsi refers to such people as lay jurists, fuqaha al-awam, and states that most of them come from villages or are craftsmen, أهل القرى والحرف. The readiness to condemn fellow Muslims, according to Nabulsi, is associated with lack of urban sophistication or of professional legal training. Nabulsi provides a general rule which draws the line between the crude slurs of unqualified imitators and the fair rulings of competent jurists. And I'm quoting Nabulsi here. Know that the negative statements of jurists in their books are always directed against corrupt doings and evil intentions, without judging a specific person or a particular group of people. They make these general statements so that the believer may avoid and guard himself against evil predicaments. You should thus not understand law as it's understood by the lay jurists of our time. These have turned it, the law that is, into mere statements which are enacted in places where they do not apply. Nabulsi goes on to assert that competent jurists and scholars would not think ill of individual members of the community. During periods of prevalent corruption, such scholars may issue general warnings against certain kinds of belief or action. However, no particular individual can be accused of this corruption except through the appropriate legal procedures, which is a very difficult thing to do, in the words of Nabulsi. There is a very clear divide then between assessing an act and judging particular individuals performing this act. This same distinction is invoked by many 18th century thinkers in their final assessment of Wahhabi thought. Nabulsi's contempt for the lay jurists contrasts with his respectful attitude to the common Muslims. In reference to God's commands, Ahkam Allah, he argues that it is forbidden to withhold knowledge from Muslims. Withholding knowledge, he adds, is premised on the assumption that because of the way they look or dress, certain Muslims are not capable of rationalizing or understanding and are generally undiscerning. Such assumptions, Nabulsi maintains, are prohibited because thinking ill of Muslims is prohibited. In response to objections raised against his uncensored teaching of ordinary Muslims in public and private lessons, Nabulsi invokes the example set by the Prophet Muhammad, whom he maintains used to address people with things which were perceivable to them as well as with others which were not, such as the accounts of the night trip, Isra wal-Maraj, and the like. Moreover, according to Nabulsi, Islam is not based on the rational designation of goodness and badness, As such, scholars are obliged to inform Muslims of the requirements of the law, even if they cannot always rationally discern the inherent value of these requirements. Nabulsi even suggests that adherence to the scriptural injunctions of the Quran and the Sunnah are in fact licenses granted that work in favor of ordinary Muslims. It's a license to give them the, without necessarily having to understand all the rationale behind these rulings. The difference between right and wrong is spelled out in the scripture, saving Muslims the difficulty of having to resort to uncertain speculation. Nabulsi also maintains that there is no evidence whatsoever that the lawgiver, Muhammad here, has ever concealed any legal knowledge. Injunctions by later scholars to conceal certain kinds of knowledge refer only to the science of the truth of Sharia, alim haqa'iq Sharia, the Sufi sort of knowledge, which is acquired through taste and experience. Nabulsi's refined mystical thought finds common cause with ordinary Muslims in the face of mediocre jurists. The latter's claim to exclusive scholarly authority is particularly troubling to Nabulsi. Equally objectionable are the exclusive claims of theologians, criticizing people who define God in terms of mental constructs. Nabulsi thus identifies theologians, mutakallimun, as the opponents of Sufi knowledge and goes on the offensive against the basic premise of their discipline. Salvation, he argues, is attainable only by adhering to the way of the elite, the people of sincere devotion. This is the way to achieve truthfulness in worship, as-sidq fil ubudiyya, as well as the profession of unity in lordship, tawhid al-rububiyyah. And again, using some of the same terms, tawhid al-uluhiyyah and the rububiyyah and so on, but in a very, very different context than Wahhabism. The language used here by Nabulsi is strikingly similar to that used by Ibn Abdul Wahhab. However, the superficial linguistic similarities between the two thinkers can hardly conceal the complete and unqualified contrast of the two sets of ideas. Nabulsi is clearly aware of attacks on fellow Sufis, and his writings are partly motivated by his attempt to respond to these attacks. Such exchanges are not new. What is interesting, however, is Nabulsi's appropriation of the same language used by opponents of Sufism and advocates of extreme forms of takfir. Nabulsi employs the categories of hidden and manifest association, shirk, khafi, and jali, to defend Sufism. Manifest association, he maintains, is that which includes a belief which compromises the principle of absolute oneness of God, the latter being the most central of all Sufi beliefs. Nabulsi adds that through their rational reflection, theologians arrive at only part of the truth and fail to grasp its totality. A theologian misbehaves when he abandons religious shari'i knowledge and adheres instead to speculative meanings. When he follows the way of proofs and demonstration and disregards admission of certain religious texts and submission to them, claiming to be self-sufficient in knowledge and making his self-sufficiency obligatory on all legally responsible Muslims. The trait which is common to lay jurists and theologians in Nabulsi's portrayals is their creedal exclusivity. The formulations of the former are ill-informed, whereas those of the latter are the result of excessive speculation. Both, however, wrongly impose their formulations on Muslims and readily condemn any divergence from them. The advantage of Sufism, according to Nabulsi, is that while it's in closer conformity with the apparent injunctions of the divine law than theology, it is not used as a weapon for condemning Muslims and violating their sanctity. This is, to Nabulsi, the epitome. This is the main thing, the main trait enjoyed by Sufis. Even more than Nabulsi, all the major thinkers of the 18th century managed to formulate meaningful, often very strict, codes of social behavior. Shawkani was mentioned and San'ani was mentioned. They had no stomach for Sufism at all. They were extremely strict in terms of the application of the law. So they managed to formulate strict codes of social behavior and religious practice without condemning Muslims and falling into the trap of takfir. Ibn Abdul Wahhab was fixated on unveiling the secret sins, shirk al-khafi, of multitudes of Muslims and on exposing their hidden unbelief. His was a utopian vision exclusively founded on a doctrinal reading of religion. In contrast, the other 18th century thinkers were primarily concerned with articulating a social order derived from their understanding of Islam. Unlike the Wahhabi dogmatic understanding of Tawheed, For these thinkers, the fundamental meaning of unity was encapsulated in the taboo against the shedding of the blood of fellow Muslims. Despite substantial differences in objectives and projects, the stance against takfir was a common, and I would argue, unifying feature of the reformers of the 18th century. What they had in common was a deep concern for the Muslim community, which was fundamentally disregarded in the thought of Ibn Abdul Wahhab. Most of these thinkers articulated rigorous criticism of practices and beliefs prevalent in Muslim societies, but despite their strictness, the sanctity of Muslim life was a line they were not willing to cross. 18th century reformers often viewed religious doctrine through the prism of human interest. This, in a sense, explains the retraction by two Yemeni thinkers, San'ani and Shawkani, of praise poems they wrote when they were young of Ibn Abdul Wahhab. They praised Ibn Abdul Wahhab and then they retracted these poems. By withdrawing their praise, these thinkers expressed their realization that Ibn Abdul Wahhab did not provide solutions for the problems of Muslim societies, but that he himself was a symptom of these problems. The preponderance of ideas antithetical to Wahhabi doctrines among the leading thinkers of the periods preceding, during, and after the time of Ibn Abdul Wahhab is a telling indicator of the ways in which 18th century Muslim thinkers defined belief and mapped the boundaries of their faith. So, how do we explain Daesh? Why would an isolated takfiri strand of Islam gain currency in our times? To answer this question, I would venture very few tentative ideas, and perhaps, I don't know if we will have a chance, but maybe we can discuss these ideas later. First, takfiri ideologies are simple, and they're not encumbered by complex analysis or the intervention of learned traditions. One begins to appreciate the value of taqlid, of learned traditions. Although we were accustomed to, how great ijtihad is and so on and so forth, but ijtihad becomes, free for all. Anyone can say whatever they want. So takfiri ideologies, I think, are simple and not encumbered by complex analysis of or the intervention of learned traditions. By the way, quite often, yes. One needs to attend a lesson or two, only one needs to attend a lesson or two with one of these takfiri sheikhs and then go to his or her mother and who's been praying all her life and tell her, sorry, all your prayers will not be accepted. After just one or two. I mean, it is really simple, it's so and it's so reductive. Also, takfiri thought is empowering, and with only a few quotes enables people to speak with the authority of God. But perhaps as important as both of these factors is that the viciousness of takfir mirrors the brutal regional tyrannies and the cruel global order that sustains them. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dalal. The floor is with Professor Musa. 30 minutes, and then we open discussions.
Thank you. Good morning and salamat. Thank you very much, Professor Dalal, for inviting me to this important conference. And it's a great honor to be at AUB and to be in Beirut again. And even a greater honor to engage in the work of Professor Talal Asad, his scholarship and his ideas. Many of you know Professor Asad in different capacities, may know him much more intimately and closely than I do, but over the years, many years ago, he was invited to South Africa when I was still a very up-and-coming or young scholar, and great excitement of Talal Asad landing there. Mahmoud Mamdani invited him. It was a great joy, and always very inspirational engagement. A characteristic of my relationship with Professor Asad has been that he's been in a kind of an amazing gesture of what I would call loving friendship. Very caring, giving of his time, and I cannot do better than Mutanabbi, who talked about friendship, that saying that the friendship of the best kind. Mutanabbi, in his exaggerated way, said that the best kind of friendship is when you love with the heart of your beloved, or when you can see with the eyes of your beloved. مَا الْخِلُّ إِلَّا مَنْ أَوَدُّ بِقَلْبِهِ وأرى بطرف لا يرى بسوائه. So today I want to talk about destabilizing orthodoxies, a pluralism in Muslim ethical traditions. In an important essay that Professor Asad had written, The Idea of an Anthropology of Islam, he forcefully writes that orthodoxy is crucial to all Islamic traditions. And he resists anthropologists who say that Islam as an analytical category dissolves as well. Countering this wrong-headed interpretation of some anthropologists, Asad argues that Islam is a tradition, and we know that, and there are people in the audience who spent a great deal of time explicating Professor Asad's ideas. For Asad, a tradition consists of, quote, discourses that seek to instruct practitioners regarding the correct form and purpose of a given practice, end of quote, and as an established practice also has a history. And these discourses relate conceptually to a past and a future through the present, end of quote. So today I want to, through some of the work that I'm doing, I'm hoping that we will be able to explore this notion of tradition a little bit in greater complexity. Where Professor Asad disagrees with Al-Zain is that Al-Zain says that the word Islam cannot be a category. So when Professor Asad replaces that and say we have to think of it as a discursive tradition, the question that I'm struggling with is whether we're talking about discursive representations of Islam. So it is discursivity of Islam is what we have. And I'm wondering whether what the difference is between Al-Zain's position, who looks at other kinds of ways of looking at symbols and deep structure as a way to identify. But I think that the discursive representation of Islam, or Islam is a discursive tradition, it's a knowledge tradition, it's about argument about knowledge that makes it a tradition. That is what Islam is. Of course, there's also practices that emanates from that. So in that sense, the only thing we have are Muslims, Muslim discursive practices, and that's what we have to work with. The other category that Asad introduces is orthodoxy, and he insists that orthodoxy is crucial to all Islamic traditions. And he decries those who try to dismiss orthodoxy or reduce it to a set of doctrines, and argues that such proponents miss something crucial. What they miss, he says, is that orthodoxy is not merely a body of opinion, but a distinctive relationship, a relationship of power. And so I think that I would like to engage in a conversation and explore further, because I think this does deserve greater scrutiny, and that is that this relationship of power is an interpretive power. This relationship of power, where does this relationship of power, where is it embedded? In one sense, in my view, it is about the power to interpret. And how does that interpretation take place? Asad, in that essay, has a number of normative terms like the right concept, the correct model, and saying that, you know, an anthropology of Islam should begin with the concept of a discursive tradition that includes and relates itself to the founding text of the Quran and Hadith. And therefore, in that sense, there's a strong normative trend involved in some of his articulation of this orthodoxy. And I struggle with this idea of orthodoxy because I want to pluralize it. I want to think of it that there are multiple ways that one can think about orthodoxy. And Uwaymir Anjum, who's here, has written an excellent essay elucidating some of Professor Asad's viewpoints. What I look at in some of my work, my current work, is I'm looking at some trends in what I would call a South Asian Muslim orthodoxy, especially the ulama who are aligned to the Deoband school. The Deoband school, for those who are not familiar, is an institution founded in the town of Deoband in 1867. It's a kind of a franchise that now has several branches. Each branch is independent, but they're connected. What unites one Deobandi school to another, mostly madrasas, but also institutions, ulama institutions in different parts of South Asia, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, is something what they call a maslak. A maslak, that's a term that comes from a Arabic term from suluk, which is also used for adherence to a Sufi practice or to some kind of normative behavior. And the Deobandis always talk about that they have a maslak. And that comes close to some kind of a nomos, a normative world. And they have a detailed description of how adherence to their school can take place if you comply to certain of their provisions. So in Deoband is first and foremost an ethical and moral franchise that advocates a specific nomos or maslak from among traditional blends of Islam. Since the most important contribution of the traditional ulama is in the sphere of Islamic law and ethics, the Deobandi ulama's near monopoly of ethical discourse is significant. And the term that I use, nomos, I derive from Robert Cover's work. He's an American jurist who talks about law and ethics in a similar vein. And he argues that more important than rules, principles of justice, or formal institutions are narratives. Narratives that locate and give meaning to the law. And Maslak provides that narrative. So when you study Deobandi works, you will see that they have a detailed narrative that describes, shapes, and regulates the normative universe of adherents who adhere to traditional Islamic thought and practices. In Cover's words, law and narrative are inseparably related. Quote, every prescription is insistent in its demand to be located in discourse, to be supplied with history and destiny, beginning and end, explanation and purpose. And these narratives can be thick or thin, and they can provide coherence and make them persuasive, or they can be thin and be less persuasive. And in many ways, that squares with Professor Talal Asad's idea of tradition, where he talks about similar ideas about a history and also a future and a present and a past. So in Cover's view, and I think in Deobandi understanding of a nomos or a maslak, the force of interpretive commitments holds the normative universe together. What has intrigued me in my exploration of representative samples of Deobandi ethical discourse is their sustained rhetorical commitment to key elements of this maslak, which often involves a critique of their adversaries, which include, among others, Western proponents of Islam, or Westernization, or modern proponents of Islam, but also the Ahlul Hadith, the people who follow the Hadith tradition. In shorthand, they would call them Salafis, but Indian Salafis are different from Salafis that one would find in different parts of the world of the Middle East, because you would find a whole spectrum of them. You can find radical elements within them, but you can also find a very strong pietist element in them. And what is interesting is that when it comes to, on the one hand, they would understand the idea of maslak to be ways in which they critique the others and their rivals, but at the same time, through the maslak, they would be able to justify and provide interpretations to validate a number of practices derived from science and technology, economic practices from banking, organ transplantation, to questions of women's issues, and a whole range of practices through an understanding of this nomos or this maslak. In other words, the pragmatic and tradition-based reasoning in Deobandi ethical deliberations is at one level striking, and at another level fairly common. At times, their maslak becomes an object in and of itself, i.e. the tradition itself or preserving the tradition becomes the very object, rather than the larger purpose, for instance, that what the maslak should serve and the goals that the maslak should provide. And that creates a certain kind of tension in Deobandi thinking. So I want to give you and talk about, very briefly, about two fatwas, one in some detail, the other one I will just summarize to make my point. Around about 2005, there was a major incident in India. A woman by the name of Imrana in the place called, in a town called Muzaffarnagar, was raped. And the case of her rape became a center of media attention. Why was this so? Well, that Imrana claimed that the rapist was her father-in-law. But that was not the source of the media furore. Deoband, the town, is not very far from Muzaffarnagar, and a low-level mufti issued a ruling saying that Imrana is no longer married to her husband because she had sex with the father-in-law. Of course, this created a great deal of media attention. A variety of groups intervened, from women's organizations and political organizations, including Muslim groups. The Deobandi argument and the whole institution went behind this position because the ruling is like this, that amongst the 4 Sunni law schools that are prevalent, it's only the Deoband school who believe that illicit sexual interaction between a ascendant prevents you from marrying the descendant. So if you had sex with somebody's, if you had a marriage with the father or a mother, you cannot marry the descendant of that father or mother. So the daughter or the son, you cannot marry them. The other law schools say, no, that would not count. This was illicit sex. The question here is that only marriage creates those these walls of consanguinity or the barriers of consanguinity, and it is not this act. So opposing the Deobandis were the Ahlul Hadith. The Ahlul Hadith school said, no, this marriage stays and is on track. There's nothing wrong with this marriage. Of course, a crime was committed. No one gave attention to this crime. So even a rival interpretation to the Deobandi interpretation, that's how tradition works, you have rival interpretations. Even the rival interpretation that was seemed to be benevolent to the marriage did not pay attention to the crime of rape that was at the center of this. So both the Deobandi interpretation worried about hurmatul musahara, about the barriers of consanguinity and that there's no marriage. The Salafi group saying there is a marriage, very little comment on this act, this very violent act this woman had been subjected to, and the outcome of this, the psychological trauma and all those issues have not received any attention from these scholars. The Deobandis, of course, upbraided the Muslim critics of their ruling, dismissed such figures as faux reformers who were unqualified to venture on opinion in religious matters. Even worse, they lambasted critics for possessing the temerity to challenge the religious scholars, the ulama, and the Muslim critics who challenged their ruling, they claim, were driven by malice, ignorance, and with a goal to earn cheap publicity. While all that might be true, it seems that the substantive issue was not addressed. Other religious scholars, like a few individuals, did some hang gliding over the issue, but lost nerve at the last minute, failing to explicitly state that the charge of rape needed attention. Everyone was worried about the breaking of the rules regarding body parts, but little attention to the crime. Now, in this example, you see that the question is, tradition, its norms and values were adhered to, but the question is that does the tradition deal with the substantive questions at hand, and why did the tradition fail to do so? Another example that I can give is one of a fatwa that goes between two countries, from India to South Africa. In the 1960s, a very important figure of the Deoband school, and he was the rector of the Deoband school by the name of Qari Muhammad Tayyib, visited South Africa. A Muslim businessman by the name of A.M. Mullah told him that Muslims in South Africa, especially Asian Muslim businessmen, were engaged in bank interests and transactions that involve banking interests, riba, and whether there was some way that this issue could be addressed and made, there could be a solution for that. Tayyib then went with the istifta back to Deoband, and a year later, Deoband gave a ruling that the Muslim minority in South Africa could take bank interest because they are in a Darul Harb. They are in a territory of, how does one translate this? A territory of hostility. And most people misunderstand the notion of Darul Harb. Darul Harb are those territories with which a sovereign Muslim territory had not had a agreement or a treaty. That's what is called a Darul Harb. But many people think that that is territories on which Muslims are engaging in war. It is basically a territory with which you don't have an agreement or a treaty, and therefore it would be a state of potential hostility. So when this fatwa arrives in South Africa, it creates instant consternation amongst various Muslim publics. Muslims in South Africa today amount to 1 million out of population of 43 million. In the 1960s, they were possibly less than about 500,000. They're also ethnically divided between people of South Asian background and people of East Asian background from Indonesia, Malaysia, and other places. Those who come from East Asian background, many of the religious scholars are trained in the Middle East, Egypt, and nowadays Saudi Arabia and other parts. And those who come from South Asia, their leadership is trained in India and Pakistan. So when this fatwa arrives in South Africa, this fatwa is based on Hanafi law. It's Hanafi law that says that interest in a Darul Harb is permissible between Muslim and non-Muslim. The response was quite interesting. From the Muslim political activists who were engaged in fighting the apartheid regime, they immediately said that this is unacceptable. For them, it was unacceptable on the basis of politics because they thought that this would make Muslims into some kind of a special group, and that the term they're in a Darul Harb, in a Darul Harb, that they make them into Harbis, they're fighting Harbis. For them, that didn't go off well because it alienated Muslims from the larger population of South Africa, which South African Muslim Democrats were trying to integrate South Asians and people of Malay extraction into the population, into the political struggle of South Africa, so that there can be no discrimination between people, so that the regime does not discriminate and play up Indian and colored against black people. So an outspoken champion of the cause of this group was Fatima Mir, a prominent sociologist, very close to Nelson Mandela, and she was the strongest opponent of this position. But interestingly, the Deobandi Mufti in South Africa, the Deobandis, their group in South Africa, Mufti Ibrahim Sanjalvi, also responds to this fatwa. And he basically argues, almost in a Salafi way, saying that the interest is prohibited in the Quran and the Sunnah, and therefore it cannot be made licit in South Africa. In other words, he ignores the canonical interpretation of Deoband, because Deoband follows a very strict maslak, madhab-based interpretation of fatwa, which is not about going back to the text, but is going back to the rajah opinion, the dominant opinion of the law school by which you operate. It works from a set of fatwa compendia, particularly amongst them is Ibn Abidin's compendium, but also Fatawa Alimgiri. And so with that, in an interesting way, local Deoband, South African Deoband, corrects and offers a rival interpretation to Deoband Central, to Deoband India, and in that way provides another way out. And it would also be extremely difficult for the Deobandis to hold that position, given just the overwhelming attitude of Muslims who are literate and read the Quran and understand it, know a priori that interest is prohibited. So in order to circulate that fatwa would have been difficult, and the other scholarly communities in South Africa, those who had trained elsewhere, would not take very kindly to that kind of position. And so in that way you see that a rival position had been provided, and therefore you see that, you know, another way of dealing with a fatwa within a school can create alternatives and new ways of interpretation. If you look at the work of Qari Muhammad Tayyib, who is this important exponent of the Deoband Maslak, he would argue, for instance, that it is absolutely crucial that one should grasp the principles, the usul, the universal maxims, the qawaid kulliyah, and precepts, the wabid that underlie the teachings of Islam. In doing so, he would say, one was then able to relate how Islam's doctrines, values, ethics, devotions, and social transaction fit in with the prophetic model. It appears that by usul or principles, Tayyib meant those reasons, arguments, and authority that served as a foundation for other consequential developments. Principles in his vocabulary also played the role of a universal maxim, qaida kulliyah. In other words, the principle became the standard by which all derivatives were weighed and measured. By dawabit or precepts, he meant a general rule that controlled the action of all particulars, that is juz'iyat, in a specific topic. In other words, Tayyib detested the idea that the hermeneutical paradigm inherited from previous generations should in any way or form be molested. For to alter these inherited standards and precepts of evaluation to him meant to break with the past. In fact, he goes so much, he argues that to give a reinterpretation of a hadith, for instance, the work that people like Albani and other people do to reinterpret hadith is not acceptable, because if you pull out a card and say that a hadith that somebody accepted as sound now proves to be unsound, you're basically pulling out a card from the bottom of the stack, and the whole, pack of cards can collapse. He's not in favor of that. In other words, the reasons that were provided for actions in the past ought to be kept alive, revalidated if necessary, with fresh arguments, in order that they may remain part of the grounds of adjudication. What would be acceptable are epistemic supplements. In fact, he made it explicit that there should be no dissonance between the new and old hermeneutic. With unmistakable clarity, he wrote, quote, "The very first imperative to bear in mind when compiling tadween and conciliating tartib of Islamic thought is to do so by keeping in mind the existential foundational interpretive principles, asasi usul." He speaks in Urdu, he writes in Urdu. This ensures that renovation is not bereft of the emotive insight, the dhawq, inherent in these principles. For ultimately, these very interpretive principles, I'm still quoting him, lead to the maxims, qawaid, and goals, maqasid of the Sharia. These principles and maxims are actually the embodiment of the prophetic methodology, minhaj nubuwwat. Absent these inherited maxims and precepts, dhawabit, there can be no true renovation of Islamic thought. The result would be merely be a simulacrum of renovation, dimaghi fikr ka tashkil, dimaghi fikr ki tashkil. So it'll only be a simulacrum of that, end of quote. To be a Deobandi is to combine, or if you want, articulate a nomos in which comprehensive interpretive principles are blended with personal intellectual mentorship and apprenticeship sohbat with a teacher. Not only did Tayyib clearly state that any renovation of thought should be realigned with the inherited interpretive framework or hermeneutical paradigm, but he also believed that certain specific practices could not be skirted. Precepts related to devotional acts and dogma that were derived from the universal maxims, Tayyib argued, generated a number of particular applications, juz'iyat, which were in themselves authorized by the Sharia. Hence, when it came to doctrinal beliefs and devotional practices, he countenanced no charge, change, or alteration. However, there were spheres of life where he did countenance change or development. These were the zones of interhuman transaction, mu'amalat, social intercourse, mu'ashara, political life and social life, siyasa, he argued. These spheres of life overtly carried the imprint of their times and thus mutable. In these areas, he rationalized, the Sharia provided an abundance of general principles and a paucity of specific applications. In fact, he argued that the Sharia mindset itself anticipated that the particular application designed to serve the specific spheres of interhuman transactions, politics, and social life were time sensitive, and therefore they were designed to change according to the vicissitudes of time. I could go on, but I think the point is clear that in someone like Tayyib argues that there can be some kind of interpretation and possibilities. So it seems that, for instance, the Deobandis in South Africa, who were looking at the comprehensive story of bank interests in South Africa, clearly understood some of Tayyib's message and provided an alternative response within the Maslak framework. But in 2005, Deobandis are so caught up and insistent on the idea of upholding the paradigm of the Maslak rather than the purpose and objective of the Maslak, that they kept on hammering away at this point and argued for their position that Imran's marriage to her husband was null and void, and if she remained in a marriage, she would be living in sin. I want to say something about something larger in this, and that is that that one of the ways in which I think about these issues is to work through it through a kind of a constructivist approach, both a constructivist epistemology and constructivist history and sociology. I know in some of his work, Professor Asad is a little bit agnostic about constructivism, but I'm sure he will indulge me here today. Constructivism indicates, quote, a particular way of understanding the relation between what we call knowledge and what we experience as reality. In contrast to that perspective or relation often called realism, constructivist accounts of cognition, truth, science, and related matters conceive the specific features of what we experience, think of, and talk about as the world, objects, entity boundaries, properties, categories, and so forth, not as a priori, not as prior to and independent of our sensory, perceptual, motor, manipulative, and conceptual discursive activities, but rather as emerging from, or as it is said, constructed by those activities. The paradigms or the tradition-based learning and practice adopted by the ulama and the revivalist thinkers have been affected by the engagement with modern understandings of history and modern science. Taking science and history seriously was possibly the single most significant factor that set some individual ulama figures inclined to a revivalist spirit and modern Muslim thinkers apart from the majority who adhered to a more doctrinaire version of the tradition. Not only had natural science transformed every department of modern thought and action, but as R.G. Collingwood so aptly recognized, it also profoundly shaped philosophical thinking. From this transformation in practice stemmed the notion of what Collingwood called historical thinking, the ability to foster the idea of history where the crucial ingredient was constructive history. Historical imagination was structural, an imaginary picture of the past, not a linear, reflexive, and common sense view of the past. In short, historical imagination was a form of thought that was self-dependent, self-determining, and self-justifying. In other words, it puts the present into a very, very prominent position. And I think this view of the self, of how it shapes tradition and also self-understanding requires greater scrutiny. And I would want to argue that in many ways, this narrative retelling of the tradition is possibly one of the most important issues in contemporary Islamic thought, and the idea of Islam today, as this conference is dedicated to, is the one central issue that contemporary Islamic thought may want to pay more attention to. The battle lines between those who do and adhere to the tradition in a very doctrinaire fashion and those who are trying to explore the tradition and ask questions are very clearly drawn. And they come with a very significant price to those who engage in them. And I think that one of the key issues that I would argue is that we may want to take a position on this question of tradition by drawing on some of the work of, say, someone like what I found quite inspiring in many ways is the ideas of a man, a Polish ceratologist called Ludwig Fleck, who talked about that one might be able to think, and I say one can be able to think of tradition as the thought style or a thought collective. That Fleck, for instance, argued that scientific facts are not prior, fixed, or autonomously determinate features of an external world, but rather, as he writes, they are events in the history of thought. As he put it, the emergence of specific features of such events, what we have come to speak of as facts, are made possible but also severely constrained by the social, psychological operations of a particular thought style. Thought styles and thought collectives are interrelated. The relationship between conceptions and evidence, Fleck points out, are not determined by logical relationships. He says, quote, evidence conforms to conceptions just as often as conceptions conform to evidence. After all, conceptions are not logical systems, no matter how much they aspire to that status. There are stylized units which either develop or atrophy just as they are or merge with their proofs into others. I'm still quoting Fleck. Analogously to social structures, every age has its own dominant conceptions as well as remnants of past ones and rudiments of those of the future. It is one of the most important tasks in comparative epistemology to find out how conceptions and hazy ideas pass from one thought style to another, how they emerge as spontaneously generated pre-ideas, and how they are preserved as enduring, rigid structures owing to a kind of harmony of illusions, end of quote. And to conclude, epistemology that I want to articulate, or I try to argue here, that the current crisis in Islamic thought is that not only about tradition, but the intelligibility of tradition, and the question about the epistemological depth and the meaning of tradition today. I sometimes envy people like Alistair McIntyre, where they can talk about tradition and pull out and draw on an entire pre- and post-Enlightenment tradition of scholarship and so on, and draw upon that and talk effortlessly about that. When you do that in terms of Islamic thought, it takes a lot more work, and that the work has just begun. But I do believe that there is a possibility to do so, the retelling, the re-narrating of this tradition in order to make it relevant to the present. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you, Professor. I open the floor for discussions, questions, and answers, something like 15 minutes, I suppose. 15, 20 minutes. Yes, please. Is there a microphone going around? We can use this one if you want. Is it possible to have an assistant around? Oh, this one, the wireless. Yeah, the wireless. Ah.
So I appreciate Hamdalad's talk that looks at phenomena like Daesh and looks backwards and observes where these ideas and these approaches come from. But something I'd like to add to this is that I mean, we've been talking about jihadi takfiri thought since 9/11. But from today's perspective, from the last couple of years back, I think it's also fruitful to compare this with other forms of boundary drawing and thereby justifying political violence. And I'm thinking particularly here about, we talked about the Nabulsi, but talking about Sufi ways of justifying political violence. And if we look at both Syria and the case of Egypt recently, it's less about takfir, it's more about labeling the other as Khawarij, and very often it's a mode of justifying state violence against others who are rebelling against state violence. So I think that can be quite productive. The second point I want to make is that it's very important what you said about the difference between calling an action or a belief unbelief and calling the actor an unbeliever. And I think the former is actually extremely widespread in Islamic thought. It's not in no way limited to Wahhabi thought. Ghazali says somebody who complains about the weather, I mean, that's a kind of unbelief because weather is fate. But I think this movement from work, I mean, basic work like Khalid Nasafiyya, where you have all this movement from works of doctrine into fiqh, so for example, the Durar al-Sunniyya, Fatawa al-Najdiyya, where it becomes a way of interacting with others, of seeing them as unbelievers. I mean, that is a simplified but also very powerful way of interacting in the world. And I recently saw a segment from Saudi television where the Mufti was asked,
For the sake of time, we only have 20 minutes. So.
he was asked about Daesh, and he says, yes, they are unbelievers because they're actually Ba'athists. And so they're unbelievers, their blood is halal, and so on and so on. So, I mean, it's a takfiri logic of simplifying the discussion. We don't have to argue about, they're just unbelievers. Anyway, thank you.
I'll take 2-3 questions and then go back to the...
Thank you to the panel. Thanks, Ahmed, for your paper. My question is with regards to your speculation as to why this multiplicity of the tradition in thinking about kufr and iman in the 18th century seems to be reducible to the popularity of a certain kind of Wahhabi and other kindred spirits in the 20th. And I guess I think I'm less speculative as to the reason, in the sense that there has been a specific, well, first of all, a major trend in Orientalism to represent what it considers to be Islam as that particular tradition to the exclusion of others, which I think ultimately makes this tradition part of a response to it, whether it's in the form of apologia or it's not assertion, but two, also a specific Western imperial history of creating and supporting and inducing a certain kind of jihadist thought, beginning especially more seriously since World War I in the case of the Ottoman Empire's declaration of jihad, its entry in the war but subsequently also in the support of a new kind of what was considered jihadist forms of Islam in the Soviet Union in the 1930s by Nazi Germany, which the US picked up in the 1950s all the way to the present. So I think there is less room for speculation and in fact a lot of room for certainty about what makes these kinds of trends popular, at least in terms of policy and representation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for all three presentations. They were really very useful. My first question very quickly to Professor Leder is, could you give us a bit more about how the German Orientalist scholarship was different about Islam was differently inflected, because Germany, was an aspiring colonial state but never quite managed it, and also since the early 20th century onwards, there's a support for the Ottoman Caliphate, there's a support for various kinds of Muslim activists within, say, South Asia, and so there's a different kind of reading at times, it seems, but perhaps if you could say a bit more about that. And Ibrahim, thank you very much for complicating the idea of orthodoxy, but I mean, in some ways, the tools of intellectual history are, and I guess this is a comment also for Professor Talal, that the tools of intellectual history are not quite adequate to think about the circulation of ideas, particularly with jihadist groups today, because we want it to be an ideology when it's not. It's a kind of a fragmented constellation of ideas. But Ibrahim, my question really was to ask you to push you to define then how precisely are you complicating the idea of an orthodoxy, because it seemed to me, I mean, variation within a tradition does not complicate that, right? So your examples seem to be about different ways of assessing assessing the same situation, or variation within Deobandi ulama in terms of how they understood a situation. But is it about method? Is it a different method that actually, is that the complication? Because variation in itself would not be, a critique of orthodoxy. Right.
So I go back to the podium and then we take a second round of questions. We have Tariq, Professor Asad.
Yes, I agree. I mean, and I did say in the beginning there's quite a bit on the trajectory of these movements and the context of their development, and you're completely right. But I think there's less analysis of the thought, of the ideological dimension, and where these ideas fit within a particular spectrum. Even a phenomenon like Daesh. I mean, Daesh has many officers from the Iraqi army. I mean, some of the leading leadership, some of the main leadership, and they're really playing a very important role. They were part of al-Ba'ath, structure, and now and there are reasons for that. Daesh also, and Nusra, and whatever, in varying degrees. I mean, there is quite a bit of support from Gulf states and so on and so forth. But they eventually, they go on their own. I mean, they listen to Khalifa, but they become a phenomenon. They're not completely reducible to the machinations, although that is certainly part of the story. I mean, Osama bin Laden is an example. Daesh is another example. Everyone knows that Bandar bin Sultan was brought back to manage the jihadi sort of war against the Syrian regime. And it's obviously going out of hand at this point. It has a life of its own, and I think that's worth studying. Right?
Thank you, Humaira, for your question. I got a bit pressed. The chairman was starting shuffle papers and said time's up. So that helps me to your question. Yeah, first of all, I think that I think it's the idea of orthodoxy immediately gets translated that the ulama are the only orthodoxy. And I think we need to complicate that to say that there are multiple thought collectives in Muslim societies, and not only give the monopoly of orthodoxy to the ulama. I must have said something right. Okay. And the other thing is that I think that the methodology that I'm proposing is that I think that the tradition-based methodology is very doctrinaire insofar as it has not developed tools to articulate itself within an idiom in the present. So it's a great deal of difficulty in translating. So for instance, if you read fatwas, it's the best place where you can see how people are trying to take articulations, formulations, syntaxes, complicated grammars of a particular time and trying to transport it into the present by doing all kinds of intellectual gymnastics with it. But there's no underlying sociology of ideas, epistemological, discussions and so on. So you're all the time working in a kind of working with nusus, what they call nasiya, right? So you're working with this text and the application of the text, but the work below the text, why this text is there, why the text has arrived here, what the meaning of the text is now today, that kind of work has begun to be taken, some places began. There's a big debate, for instance, in Lebanon. A guy by the name of Yahya Muhammad, for instance, written a book called Al-Qati'a Bayn al-Muthaqqaf wal-Faqih. Another one by the name of Al-Milad works on Mihnatul Muthaqqaf ad-Dini. This crisis of the religious intellectual that is there, I think this is fairly pervasive and in many places. So I think that I don't have a good answer, but I do know where one can begin, is to begin to think about these issues in much more complicated ways, to bring other kinds of knowledges. And McIntyre has a very interesting quote that I intended to quote, but you gave me an opportunity to do so. He says, a tradition then not only embodies the narrative of an argument, but is only to be recovered by an argumentative retelling of that narrative, which will itself be in conflict with other argumentative retellings. Every tradition, therefore, is always in danger of lapsing into incoherence, and when a tradition does so lapse, it sometimes can only be recovered by a revolutionary reconstitution. That's in his essay, Epistemological Crises. And I think that's precisely that many thinkers are at that place in Muslim thought. But when this kind of rethinking begins, all kinds of fatwas come out that you're trying to, undermine Islam. So what the ulama have very successfully done, and they've done so with the collaboration of states and dictatorial states, is that they have sacralized their methodological approach, that challenging any element of that methodology invokes the trigger of kufr and takfir. And in the way Ahmad has said, not the person, but the idea, that this kind of thinking leads to kufr. This is heresy. So the person can, so Abu Zayd, for instance, taken to court and turned into an apostate or a kafir or whatever they call him. And, Agrama has worked on how that whole complicated process works. So any kind of thinking, that doesn't only apply there. 2 days ago, 4 days ago, a man who, in Karachi University, Professor Shakil Oj, got shot, killed. He has been outspoken on a number of issues. It's somewhat ironic also, the recent article he wrote in Ma'arif, which is a very respectable academic journal in India. He wrote about how nail polish, women wearing nail polish would not, invalidate the wudu if they made wudu over that. And of course, he becomes a martyr to Yves Saint Laurent, but in a very sad way. But there you have it. These kinds of ideas, his sensibilities of challenging that generated. The story is not completely out. That what happened, why was he targeted? But clearly, thinking through some of these issues are extremely challenging, and there's great hostility to that.
Yes, I take that. So to make one thing clear, you cannot establish German Orientalism or Islamic studies as a battleground for a post-Saadian vision of European scholarship. First of all, of course, Germany was a colonial country, and there are lots of relationships between scholarly approaches and their way to serve colonial ideas. But on the other hand, and that is probably what you are hinting at, when we look into the scholarly practices of 19th and early 20th century, we would rather perceive that scholars are deeply indebted and enrooted in disciplines like classical studies, biblical studies, linguistics, and lots of their methods, approaches, and thought world is rather related to a scholarly universe that is not directly translatable into a patronizing, authorial, judgment-related scholarship on the Orient. But to help also to spread that idea, we actually are planning to translate also the study of Suzanne Marchand into Arabic, and help a bit to disseminate various approaches when we talk about the history of that kind of studies, Oriental studies.
Just on your point on the notion that tools of intellectual history are not sufficient, they certainly are not. But it's not an either or. I think we're trained in traditional Islamic studies that the 18th century is a low point in Islamic history. Intellectually, it's the lowest probably in traditional studies, and also, of course, it's the representative of that period. These are not unrelated. There's Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahab. I studied the 18th century. It's such a, there is a notion of intellectual traditions, and quite different from each other, with so much variation within these traditions, and the ability to deploy through hybridity, to come up with answers. Basically, the question that you raised initially, Brahim, it's one thing to work within the tradition, but then there is a substantive issue. There is rape here, and no one's speaking about it. They're stuck within the tradition. But there are possibilities, and there are many more examples of people being able to transcend, to address social issues, and to transcend by deploying aspects of the tradition. And systematically, by the way, not eclectically. You don't use it like you use a proverb. You throw a couple of verses from Hadith and or Quran, and that makes it Islamic. I mean, these people in the 18th century were systematic, were looking at the whole range of at their disposal, of traditions at their disposal, and they're deploying them systematically. So yes, the tools of intellectual history on their own are not sufficient, but we cannot also ignore them, and we quite often do.
Thank you. There are three very rich papers, and I do hope they will be further for reading and comment. I really have, I think, only one question, literally, to Professor Ibrahim Musa. What happened to that crime of rape? What were the actual practical consequences, and what did the people, the ulama, Yobandi and others, say about what happened? Could you tell us?
Karim. Excuse me?
Thank you. So I have a short clarificatory question also to Professor Musa. So, yeah, what you termed the constructivist approach, it seems that it is pushing towards little commitment as possible towards some sort of an ontological claim towards truth or knowledge. And at the same time, at the beginning of your talk, you interpret Asad's term, discusses discursive tradition as discursive representation of Islam. And that way of interpreting discursive tradition seems to me to push towards some sort of an ontological assumption that there is, say, Islam, and then one way to represent it is discursively, and there are other ways. And I'm interested in your position regarding, how you're squaring the constructivist approach that is moving you away, maybe justifiably, from ontology, whereas the other one seems to be committing you. Thank you.
Thank you, Karim. Sadiq, and then we in the back.
Just a short observation, really. Is there a reason why very little reference has been brought in to other schools of thought of Islam, and heavy concentration on the Sunni school of thought and the various theologians and writers? And a point, an observation really, is why is the phenomena of Daesh and all these things taking place here, and why is it taking place now? That is the brutality, Ahmed, that you refer to, in one sense. Is that brutality any more brutal than a 16-story building going down? And in a sense, the Daesh have just released a film, I don't know if you've seen it, The Flames of War. And in it, they very clearly put out what their own vision of the world is. It's really a modern snuff movie, to cut it down. But it seems to me that there is another element on which these looking at the theology and ideology going back in history has to take into consideration. And that is that, leaving out the upper levels of leadership, there are tens and thousands of men and women. What has gone on in their material and ideological lives that they can no longer live within the confines of earning $50 or $100 and eking out an existence where death and another world, however absurd it may be to us, is far better. And final point, really, how is this destruction of modern day states, particularly in the Arab world, which links to my first point, why here, the destruction of states and not even allowing any form of a class-based structure to emerge is actually giving and embedding this ideology that we're going back in time to study.
Thank you. Last question.
Okay, thanks for all the papers. You gave us a lot to think about, but I have a question for the provost. You seem to draw a correlation between the discursive tradition and the practical repercussions and ramifications of what's going on within a discursive tradition. So, and you make this comparison between al-Nabulsi and Hamad bin Abdul Wahhab. And since I might be simplifying your point, but what you said, your argument seems to be that the more nuanced a discursive theoretical tradition is, the more dynamic practical implementation is going to be. Whereas the more brute and kind of undynamic discursive theory is, the more violent and implementation is going to be. So I'm going to try to complicate this a bit more and problematize it, because there's certain examples within my head, most particularly from the Shiite tradition, in where, for example, Khomeini makes a lot of arguments about in his lessons on Usul al-Fiqh, when he's giving his students lessons, such as the probability of assurance, where the only people that won't be forgiven by God for him are those who know the truth but refuse it, whereas everyone else who isn't a jahid or isn't a mu'anid or etc. And he extends this even to non-Muslims and etc. So yes. So my basic question is that Khomeini's project practically is maybe not as violent as Daesh, but there's a lot of war, and there's a lot of in the beginning of the revolution there was a lot of blood and bloodshed, etc. So how do we account for this kind of very nuanced and complex discursive tradition, for example, with Khomeini, and how do we account for this correlation? Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good questions. I don't think I can do justice to them all. Just to Ahmad and your retreat to the 18th century. It's a very rich century, and the question is, what has happened to that discursive tradition? Why is it not alive today? Pardon me? Aborted. Exactly, but also the people who are claiming to be the heirs of that tradition are also not engaging it in a robust fashion. And so, I mean, a simple example, talking about rape, Pakistan has a varieties of traditional authorities out there. The question of rape is still not solved. They have gone through several iterations of the Hudud ordinance and so on, and cannot solve the issue. Rape is treated like another form of adultery, and complicated by colonial laws, and then Zia's Sharia implementation and so on. There you have it. So where are these treatises that ought to have been written, complex, understanding the issues? They are not forthcoming. And that itself raises a question. Why are they not forthcoming? What is happening? And I think it's the crisis in Islamic literacy. I think that the madrasas are not doing their jobs. I think the institutions are not doing their jobs, even the ones at secular universities. Both in the Muslim majority countries and Muslim minority countries. So I think there is a larger crisis of the knowledge tradition. Professor Asad's question about the crime of rape, I tried to find out what happened to that union. Did the parties separate, or did they continue? Did they follow the Ahl Hadith interpretation, or did they follow the Deobandi one? Or was there a police indictment of the father-in-law? I've tried a great deal to find out. I've not been very successful, and partly, my failure to make that inquiry properly. But it had intrigued me. One of the ways that I tried to think about, and just recently I reread your essay on pain and torture and suffering, and it struck me that this young woman, this woman in this marriage, in some ways the Hanafi ruling would possibly be compassionate if in an extended family she would see her assailant on a day-to-day basis, right? And so that would be compassionate that the marriage ends, and then she goes somewhere else, because to live in that environment, unless that person goes to jail. So the honest answer, I don't know what happened, and I don't know whether there's a prosecution for that crime. The two questions that the gentleman had, I'll be very brief. I don't think the constructivist approach moves away from ontology, but I think it reinscribes a different kind of ontology. So I think what you're going to have is that the tradition-based ontologies are going to have some kind of synchrony or dissonance with the reconstructed ontologies, and that's okay. That's okay. It's the hybridity that Ahmad Amin talked about. Muslim thinkers have always been trying to do this, trying to rebuild and reconstruct. So that's part of the reconstruction, that you are going to have some kind of indigestion at some place, but at some point you will have epistemological indigestion, but then soon you begin to deal with it and you normalize it. But it takes time. So I don't think it's either or. And there are ontologies in constructivist approaches too, but they're just not the ones that might square with the traditional ontologies and concerns. But that's precisely why the present of tradition is so important. And how does the present reinscribe and remake the ontologies that we inherit?
Stefan?
Yeah, that's just very short remark on this correlation between Takfiri extremist positions and mainstream Sunni Islam suffers from various problems. One problem is probably that empirical data is still very scarce, and the other main issue concerns how mainstream traditional Islam was perceived in that movement of As-Sahwa al-Islamiyya since the 70s. And just to give an idea, if you look into the prefaces of authors who have been who display a lot of expertise and are dealing with these texts, but when you look into what they have to say about them, then you often have very crude ideas that combine some circumstantial aspect of their experience with these texts. So there has been a completely dissociation between history and the reading of these traditional texts. And in a way, these dissociation between philosophy and textual practices is also mirrored in the theological education that future imams receive. They are completely dissociated again, I say, deep rupture between that tradition and Islamic philosophies. In Egypt, every innovative input comes from, if ever, comes from Islamic philosophy, which has no connection at all to theology. So it is also not only it's also how knowledge production is organized. And probably one doesn't even have to look into correlation between mainstream Sunni and Takfiri positions, because they do not originate in Sunni thought work. They originate from social practices of knowledge building in the region.
On the second question, those of us who are old enough would remember that when the Islamic revolution in Iran succeeded, there was quite a bit of literature on how Shia Islam is prone to be radical and extreme and whatever, whereas Sunni Islam is docile and peaceful and so on and so forth. And now, of course, there is another school of the terrorist experts and so on who've been arguing that, forgot about Shiism, and now it's the Sunnis who are. Of course, violence is a main instrument of power throughout history, and people deploy it in many different ways, there are, the Shia tradition has its, use of violence, but the issue is, and then to come to Tariq's question, why at this particular moment Daesh is up? I agree with you. There are many. I mean, these are the contextual things that have been studied, and there's a lot of information, and there is a sort of a clear trajectory in many cases on that explains why in this current historical moment, after several years of war, and first in Iraq and then now in Syria, and the destruction and so on and so forth, the destruction of state structures, alternative states, bad as they may be, by the way. I'm not saying that there are no tears shed on these states, but still, the vacuum, the utter, the abject poverty, the level of violence, of course, which is sanitized, but it's violent nonetheless, and in fact, the destructive power of that violence is far greater than the crude violence that is on display by Daesh and so on. All of these are factors that, to my mind, explain why some people actually are, admire the defiance of these groups. Admire the cruelty and defiance. I mean, they are attracting followers after all. They are recruiting, they are attracting followers. Whether they'll be able to build a state and sustain it is a different question, but they are attracting followers, and there are reasons for that. I briefly said in my introduction that I will not be focusing on that. There is more said, but I would like to talk about the ideological dimension of things. And I think ultimately we have to be able to do both.
Stefan, Ibrahim, and Ahmad, thank you very much for quite challenging, lively, and enlightening session. Thank you very much.
What are we going to do now?
Coffee break. Yeah, please.